My mom and sister tried for years to fix my relationship with my ex, but I married someone else and am expecting a child. I was 25 when things started shifting in my life in ways I didn't expect. For years, my mom and my older sister, Lena, had been obsessed with the idea of me getting back together with my ex, Mark. We'd dated for 3 years in my early 20s, and while it wasn't a terrible relationship, it ended for a reason. Mark was a decent guy, worked hard, had a good sense of humor, always showed up on time. But we just didn't click long term. I wanted more out of life, like traveling and building a career, while he was content staying in our small hometown, working the same job, and talking about settling down way too soon. When we broke up, it was mutual, but it stung. I moved on, or at least I thought I had. Mom and Lena, though, never let it go. Every family dinner, every phone call, they'd find a way to bring him up. Mom would casually mention how Mark was doing well at his job or how he'd helped a neighbor fix their car. Lena would chime in with stories about seeing him at the grocery store, looking so mature now. It was like they were running a campaign to convince me I'd made a mistake. At first, I brushed it off. I'd laugh, change the subject, or just nod along. But after a while, it started to wear on me. I'd moved to the city, started a new job as a graphic designer, and was trying to build a life that felt like mine. The constant reminders of Mark felt like they were pulling me backward. What made it trickier was that Mom and Lena weren't just being nostalgic, they were relentless. They'd invite him to family events without telling me. I'd show up for Christmas or someone's birthday, and there he'd be, sitting at the table like he was still part of the family. It wasn't that I hated him, we'd ended things on okay terms. But seeing him there, with Mom and Lena acting like we were one conversation away from getting back together, made my skin crawl. I'd smile, make small talk, and then spend the rest of the night feeling like I was dodging a trap. The thing is, I got why they were so invested. Mark was the kind of guy who fit into their idea of a perfect life for me. He was stable, local, and familiar. Mom always talked about how she wanted me to have someone who'd take care of me, and Lena, who was married with a kid of her own, thought Mark was the key to me settling down like she had. They didn't get that I wasn't looking for that life, at least not yet. I was focused on my career, saving up to travel, and figuring out who I was outside of our small town bubble. But trying to explain that to them was like talking to a wall. They'd nod, say they understood, and then go right back to singing Mark's praises. It wasn't just family events either. Lena would send me texts with updates about Mark's life, like how he'd gotten a promotion or bought a new truck. Once she even forwarded me a photo of him at a local fair holding a giant stuffed bear he'd won. "Isn't he sweet?" she wrote. I didn't reply. I started wondering if they were more attached to him than I'd ever been. Mom would call me up and casually slip in questions about whether I was dating anyone, and if I said no, she'd say something like, "Well, you know Mark's still single." It got to the point where I dreaded picking up the phone. This went on for years. By the time I hit 27, I was exhausted by it. I'd built a decent life in the city. Good job, a small but solid group of friends, a tiny apartment I loved. But every time I went back home, it was like stepping into a time warp. Mom and Lena would start up again, and I'd feel like I was defending my entire existence. I tried setting boundaries, like telling them I didn't want to hear about Mark anymore, but it didn't stick. They'd apologize, say they just wanted me to be happy, and then a month later it'd be the same thing all over again. Then I met David. He was a coworker, a quiet guy who worked in marketing. We started talking during a project, and I liked how he listened. Really listened, not just waiting for his turn to talk. He was different from Mark, more curious about the world, always planning his next trip or reading some random book about history. We started dating, and it felt easy. Not perfect, but real. I didn't tell Mom or Lena about him for months because I knew what they'd say. They'd compare him to Mark, pick apart everything that wasn't stable about him, and I just wasn't ready for that fight. When I finally brought David home to meet them, it was a disaster. I'd prepped him for how Mom and Lena were, but I don't think he was ready for the reality. Dinner was tense. Mom kept asking him pointed questions about his job and his plans, like she was testing him. Lena barely said a word, which was worse. She just sat there with this tight smile like she was waiting for him to mess up. After we left, David said he felt like he'd been interrogated. I apologized, but inside I was furious. I'd spent years trying to live my life on my terms, and they couldn't even give my new boyfriend a chance. That night, I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep letting Mom and Lena push me toward a life I didn't want. David and I kept dating, and things got serious fast. Within a year, we were talking about moving in together. I didn't tell my family right away because I knew they'd bring up Mark again, like he was some ghost hanging over my life. But I was done living in the shadow of their expectations. I loved David, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was building something that was mine. Looking back, I think Mom and Lena meant well. They weren't trying to control me, they just thought they knew what was best. But their version of best was based on their lives, not mine. I started to see how much their pushing had affected me, how it had made me doubt my choices even when I knew they were right for me. David was the opposite of that doubt. He didn't try to fit me into some mold, he just let me be me. And that's when I knew things were about to get real. David and I moved in together about a year after we started dating. It was a big step, but it felt right. We found a small apartment in the city, nothing fancy, but it had big windows and a little balcony where we'd sit with coffee on weekends. I was 28 by then, and my career was picking up. I'd gotten a promotion at work, which meant more responsibility and a better paycheck. Life was good, and for the first time, I felt like I was building something solid, not just for me, but with someone who got me. David wasn't perfect. He could be stubborn about little things like how to load the dishwasher, but he was kind and made me laugh. We'd spend evenings planning trips we couldn't afford yet, like hiking in Iceland or eating our way through Italy. I didn't tell Mom or Lena about moving in with David for a while. I knew they'd have opinions, and I wasn't ready to deal with them. When I finally broke the news during a phone call with Mom, she went quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Oh, that's nice. Are you sure you're ready for that?" I could hear the judgment in her voice, like I was making some reckless choice. Lena was worse. When I told her, she asked why I hadn't mentioned it sooner and then started talking about how Mark had just renovated his house. I cut her off and said I didn't want to hear about him, but it was like she didn't even register it. The conversation ended awkwardly, and I didn't call either of them for a couple of weeks after that. Things got more complicated when David proposed. It wasn't a big, flashy moment, just the two of us on our balcony one evening, with him holding a simple ring and asking if I wanted to spend our lives together. I said yes, and we were both so happy we stayed up half the night talking about what our future could look like. But telling my family was another story. I waited a month before bringing it up, mostly because I was dreading their reactions. When I finally told Mom over dinner at her place, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She said she was happy for me, but then she started asking if I'd thought it through, if David was the one, and whether I was rushing things. Lena was more direct. She flat out asked why I was settling for someone I'd only known for a couple of years when Mark had been so good to me. I left that dinner feeling drained, like I'd been defending my entire life. Despite their reactions, I pushed forward. David and I planned a small wedding, just close friends and family, nothing extravagant. I wanted it to feel like us, not some big show to please everyone else. But Mom and Lena kept trying to steer things their way. Mom suggested inviting Mark to the wedding, saying it would be polite since he was still a family friend. I shut that down fast, telling her it was inappropriate and I didn't want him there. She backed off, but I could tell she wasn't happy. Lena kept dropping hints about how weddings were a big deal in our town and how I should reconsider a bigger venue. I ignored her and focused on what David and I wanted. The wedding itself was perfect. We got married in a small park near our apartment, with fairy lights strung up and a local band playing. My best friend from work was my maid of honor, and David's brother gave a speech that had everyone laughing. Mom and Lena were there, and they behaved, but I could feel their tension. They smiled for photos and said all the right things, but it was like they were holding back, waiting for me to admit I'd made a mistake. I didn't let it ruin the day, but it hurt that they couldn't just be happy for me. A few months after the wedding, I found out I was pregnant. David and I were thrilled but nervous. It wasn't planned, but we were ready to figure it out together. I was 29 by then, and the idea of being a mom felt both exciting and terrifying. We started preparing, buying baby stuff, and reading every parenting book we could find. I waited to tell Mom and Lena until I was past the first trimester, mostly because I wanted to enjoy the moment with David before their opinions came crashing in. When I finally told them, over a video call, their reactions were exactly what I'd expected. Mom got teary and said she was excited to be a grandma, but then she started talking about how she'd always hoped I'd have kids with someone familiar like Mark. Lena congratulated me, but then asked if I was sure about raising a kid in the city, saying it wasn't as wholesome as our hometown. I kept the call short and didn't bring it up again for a while. It was clear they were still hung up on the past, and I was tired of trying to convince them I'd made the right choices. Living with David and preparing for the baby made me realize how much I'd grown. I wasn't the same person I'd been when I dated Mark, and I didn't want the life Mom and Lena kept pushing me toward. They saw my choices as a rejection of everything they valued. Small-town life, stability, familiarity. But to me, it was about building something that felt true. I started setting firmer boundaries, like limiting how often I'd visit home or how long we'd talk about my life choices. It wasn't easy, and I knew it hurt them, but I had to protect my peace. As my pregnancy progressed, I focused on the future, our little family, our apartment, our dreams. David was there every step of the way, from doctor's appointments to late-night talks about baby names. I knew Mom and Lena would come around eventually, but I wasn't going to wait for their approval anymore. I'd spent too long trying to make them see my side, and I was done. My life was mine, and I was ready for whatever came next. By the time I was 7 months pregnant, life felt like it was moving at warp speed. David and I were in full nesting mode, turning our tiny apartment into a baby-friendly space. We painted the spare room a soft green, set up a crib, and argued over whether to get a stroller that could handle city sidewalks. Work was still going well, though I was starting to slow down, taking more breaks and working from home when I could. I was 29, married, and about to be a mom, and even though it was overwhelming, I felt ready. David was my rock, always calm when I started overthinking, and we'd spend evenings talking about what kind of parents we wanted to be. Telling Mom and Lena about the pregnancy hadn't gone as badly as I'd feared, but it didn't exactly bring us closer either. They were excited about the baby, but it was like they couldn't fully let go of their old vision for my life. Mom kept sending me care packages with baby clothes and handwritten notes about how she'd raised me and Lena in our hometown, hinting that it was the best way. Lena would call and talk about how she'd run into Mark at a coffee shop, saying he'd asked about me and seemed so sweet. I didn't take the bait anymore. I'd learned to nod, say something vague, and move on. It wasn't worth the fight. As my due date got closer, I started thinking more about what family meant. Growing up, Mom and Lena had been my world. They'd always been there. Mom with her endless advice, Lena with her big sister bossiness, but their fixation on Mark had created this wedge between us. I didn't want to cut them out, but I also couldn't keep letting their expectations weigh me down. I decided to have one last honest conversation with them before the baby arrived. I wanted to clear the air, not just for me, but for the family I was building with David. I invited them to our apartment for dinner. It was a big deal because they rarely came to the city. Mom always complained about the noise, and Lena acted like it was another planet. But they agreed, and I spent the day cooking, trying to keep my nerves in check. When they arrived, things started off okay. Mom complimented the apartment, and Lena seemed genuinely curious about the nursery. David was great, keeping the conversation light and making them laugh with stories about our disastrous attempts at assembling baby furniture. After dinner, I took a deep breath and laid it all out. I told them I loved them and appreciated everything they'd done for me, but their obsession with Mark had to stop. I explained how it made me feel like they didn't trust my choices, like they thought I couldn't build a good life without their input. I said I was happy with David, excited about the baby, and done looking back. I wasn't angry, just firm. I wanted them in my life, but only if they could respect the one I'd chosen. Mom got teary and said she hadn't realized how much it bothered me. She admitted she'd always seen Mark as a safe bet, someone who fit into the life she knew. Lena was quieter, but she nodded and said she'd been wrong to keep bringing him up. They both promised to do better, though. I could tell it wasn't easy for them to let go. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it felt like a start. For the first time, I felt like they actually heard me. The baby arrived a few weeks later, a girl we named Emma. The delivery was long and exhausting, but when I held her, everything else faded away. David was a mess, crying and laughing at the same time, and we spent those first few days in a haze of love and sleep deprivation. Mom and Lena came to visit a week later, and it was different this time. They were all about Emma, cooing over her tiny fingers and arguing over who she looked like. They didn't mention Mark once, and when Mom started to veer into advice about raising kids, she caught herself and asked what I thought instead. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As the months went by, I settled into being a mom. It was harder than I'd expected. Nights of no sleep, endless diapers, and figuring out how to balance work and motherhood. But David and I were a team, and that made all the difference. Mom and Lena started visiting more, and I could see them trying. They'd bring gifts for Emma and ask about my life without pushing their own ideas. Lena even admitted she liked David, saying he was good for me in a way she hadn't seen before. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot. Looking back, I realized how much I'd changed. I'd spent years feeling caught between who I was and who my family wanted me to be. Letting go of that wasn't just about standing up to them, it was about trusting myself. I didn't need their approval to know I'd made the right choices. My life with David and Emma was messy and chaotic, but it was ours. And for the first time, I felt like Mom and Lena were starting to see that too.